Maximilien de Robespierre was born into a modest family in 1758, Arras, France. Baptized the very day he was born, he was the eldest of 5 children, his father being an advocate on the Superior Council of Artois, and his mother the daughter of a local brewer. His parents' marriage mere months before his birth meant that his very conception was illegitimate in 18th century France. At the age of 6, Robespierre lost his mother, and shortly thereafter his father abandoned his family entirely. Custody over his 2 younger sisters was entrusted to his paternal aunts, while he and his brother were raised by their maternal grandmother. Despite all of these early hardships, in 1765 Robespierre entered the College of Arras, and by 1769 he won a 450 livres scholarship from the Abbey of Saint Vaast to attend the prestigious college of Louis the Great in Paris. There, Robespierre swiftly established a reputation for intellectual rigor, securing numerous prizes in Latin and Greek between 1771 and 1776. His prefect, Abbé Poyat, would later recall the young Robespierre as studious, solitary, and thoughtful, qualities which would later earn him the enduring moniker the Incorruptible. After completing his secondary education, Robespierre enrolled in the University of Paris, obtaining his Bachelor of Law on July 31st, 1780, and his Licentiate on May 15th, 1781. He promptly registered at the Paris bar, while his Louis the Great College scholarship passed to his brother Augustine. Some unverified accounts suggest that Robespierre had brief encounters with the arch-liberal Jean-Jacques Rousseau, though these recollections remain highly speculative and are likely just chronological embellishments. Robespierre was nonetheless an ardent disciple of Jean-Jacques Rousseau. He famously carried Rousseau's Social Contract as his guiding text, which was placed by his bedside as he slept. He referred to Rousseau as divine, praising how he taught Robespierre to, quote, know myself. Rousseau's doctrine that legitimate law expresses the collective will of the people was entirely taken on by Robespierre. He declared that the will of the representatives must be regarded and respected as the will of the nation, and that it carried sacred authority superior to any private will, else the nation would lose its sovereignty. Rousseau also inspired Robespierre in the importance of public virtue as the foundation of a free republic, as they both held that only a virtuous citizenry could maintain liberty. The most direct link between these two fascinating men was the concept of a civil religion, a Rousseauian idea. In The Social Contract, Rousseau argued that any stable state must have some form of public faith to bind citizens together. They must have belief in an all-powerful, just God who rewards virtue and punishes vice, and the sanctity of the social contract itself. Rousseau himself mused that if God didn't exist, he would have to be invented, a proclamation which Robespierre would take quite seriously in the time to come. Returning to Arras in late 1781, Robespierre established his legal practice alongside his sister Charlotte on Rue Samon, quickly distinguishing himself in the courtroom. In January 1782, he began pleading cases at the Council of Artois, and by March had been appointed judge at the Episcopal Court. By February 1786, he was unanimously elected as director of the Academy of Belles-Lettres. There he championed social reform far ahead of his time, such as the legitimation and pensioning of illegitimate children, proposing public incentives to adoption, and pressuring for female membership, which he succeeded in, as he admitted literates such as Marie Le Masson de Gorff and Louis de Carlou in 1787. While his private life is somewhat enigmatic, Robespierre never married. Instead, his devotion to public service, as well as the ideals of the Enlightenment, occupied his every waking hour. Robespierre's experiences of personal loss in his early childhood and his early immersion in classical learning, his legal practice in Arras, all of this reinforced his belief that law and morality has to serve the common good. By early 1789, France was on the brink of collapse. Debt-ridden and hungry, the kingdom convened the Estates Generales at Versailles in May, summoning deputies from the 3 estates of clergy, nobility, and commoners. Robespierre, newly elected by the Third Estate of Artois, arrived in Paris as a relatively obscure provincial lawyer, yet armed with his own personal clear vision, a vision that any true reform had to begin with legal equality and popular sovereignty of the masses. His first speech, delivered on June 4th, 1789, denounced the proposed double vote system that would have granted the privileged orders of France disproportionate influence over the masses. He invoked the separation of powers as well as Rousseau's concept of the general will in his argument that the sovereignty of the people cannot tolerate any division of its own right. His stance quickly drew notice among France's own radical deputies and salon circles. As the king resisted, the deputies of the Third Estate reconstituted themselves as the National Assembly on June 17th, and Robespierre threw himself into drafting the Tennis Court Oath a day later. He served on the committees which would shape the August decrees, abolishing feudal privileges, declaring equality before the law, and introducing male universal suffrage, a proposal that, though rejected then, would later reappear in his constitutional projects. With the revolutionary attitude of France rising, Robespierre joined the newly formed Jacobin Club in July 1789, aligning with other reformers, though Robespierre was very distinct from these other revolutionaries in his defense of virtue over expedience. When the Paris mob, for example, stormed the Bastille on July 14th, Robespierre warned against the unbridled violence which occurred, insisting that any populist action has to be guided by the rule of law. The pivotal moment of the revolution came when, in June of 1791, King Louis attempted to escape Paris, fleeing to Varennes. Robespierre seized on the betrayal of the king to argue that a constitutional monarchy was at that point impossible to uphold within France. In his oration to the National Assembly, he declared that the sovereign can no longer reside in one who betrays him, pressing now for the total abolition of France's monarchy and the immediate establishment of a republic. His exact proposals, though impactful in cementing Robespierre's position within the French Revolution, were only adopted way later on in September of 1792. He published several pamphlets on press, freedom, universal education, and the total abolition of capital punishment. All of these texts absolutely emphatic that liberty, absent of virtue within the people, would only descend into anarchy. Robespierre advocated for universal primary education under strict state oversight to ensure uniform quality of education and to inculcate patriotism and reason from childhood. By the close of 1791, Robespierre wasn't just some anonymous provincial citizen anymore. He was one of the revolution's most principled voices. Fast forward to the beginning of 1793 as the revolution enters its most radical phase. Robespierre, having secured election to the French National Convention, now confronted the gravest questions of Republican legitimacy. Should the dethroned former King Louis be tried for treason, and how should France defend itself against the internal insurrections and foreign coalitions? After about a week of protracted debate during the king's trial in late November to December of 1792, Robespierre rose November 30th, insisting that there was no trial to be had, for the people had judged King Louis by his flight and counter-revolutionary intrigues. When procedural delays were threatening the acquittal of the king, Robespierre returned on December 3rd to declare flatly, "Louis must die so that the fatherland may live." Although this motion did not carry the day, it did galvanize the Mountain faction and rendered any hope of reprieve as absolutely impossible. On January 21st, 1793, the convention voted 366 to 355 for the death sentence for the king, a margin transformed into 361 to 360 after a secondary ballot. On March 25th, 1793, the National Convention transformed its existing War Council into a Committee of Public Safety, which was initially composed of 25 members, among them Robespierre, whose reputation for being incorruptible made his inclusion within the committee absolutely necessary. Within weeks, the committee assumed near omnipotent authority, raising armies, directing provisioning, and organizing the Revolutionary Tribunal. Yet, even still, Robespierre was very uneasy about utilizing violence to pursue his ends. He pressured for a precise definition of what it meant to be counter-revolutionary, to protect loyal patriots from overzealous persecution, which was a measure, in fact, watered down by Maximilien Isnard. On April 24th, 1793, Robespierre presented a draft declaration that split hairs with the Girondin version. Robespierre invoked the obligation to respect the rights of others, to prevent property from undermining the safety, liberty, life, or property of our fellow citizens, and proposed progressive taxation and curbs on speculative landholding to enshrine universal fraternity and citizenship. His accompanying property speech argued that while he loved property, it must serve social utility. As he stated, I will first propose to you a few necessary articles to limit property. I will be devoted to them, but as for mud, you who value only gold, I do not wish to touch your lands nor your houses. By mid 1793, two antagonistic currents confronted Robespierre. First, the indulgence led by Danton and Desmoulins, who decried the terror as unnecessary and destructive, and the Herbertists, radical dechristianizers who were proponents of limitless severity, who demanded even wider purges than were even happening in France at the time. Robespierre, however, wanted a middle path, which was defined by rigorous but at the same time principled and disciplined repression wielded only against genuine traitors to the French Revolution. In December, he proposed a committee of justice to free unjustly imprisoned patriots, a proposal which earned heavy opposition from the Committee of General Security, which ultimately saw his proposal rejected. On September 17th, 1793, the convention enacted the Law of Suspects, which expanded criteria for arrest to include enemies of freedom, anyone failing to display the requisites of patriotism, or those who merely spoke or wrote against the revolution. Though Robespierre had argued for very precise definitions to protect innocent patriots from persecution, the final document was very broad sweeping, enabling local revolutionary committees to jail neighbors or family members and political adversaries on mere accusation. This law was a turning point. Virtue, once Robespierre's safeguard, was weaponized now into a license for denunciation. Robespierre observed in private correspondence that some committees abused suspect registers to settle personal vendettas, but his appeal for moderation was falling on deaf ears as regional representatives demanded even harsher measures. The Revolutionary Tribunal, created in March 1793 to try counter revolutionaries more quickly, had become a machine of summary justice with baseless accusations replacing authentic evidence, overseen by juries too fearful to acquit suspects. Robespierre, who had sought to restrict its jurisdiction to genuine traitors alone, was finding his efforts undermined by public panic and a mass clamor for blood. In an address on November 7th, 1793, Robespierre lamented that the tribunal must be an avenger, not an executioner, but within weeks, the number of executions was surging past 1,000 per month, something that horrified moderate deputies while boosting the morale of the extremists. At the same time as these political purges, economic legislation was strangling France's economy. The law of the maximum fixed prices on grain, bread, and essential goods under penalty of severe punishment. Robespierre had fought for price controls in the past for starving citizens because he believed that property should serve the common good, though the practical implementation of this law fell to militant enforcers who were stealing goods and imprisoning merchants regardless of intent. In one instance, a baker was executed before his own oven, accused of hoarding flour. Robespierre's later writings would decry these excesses, as in his own words, the true enemy of the poor is not the honest merchant, but the speculator who starves the nation. Maximilien Robespierre instituted a new religion in France known as the Cult of the Supreme Being in spring 1794, a deistic civil religion meant to replace atheist radicalism with a state sanctioned faith in virtue. In his May 7th speech of 1794 to the National Convention, Robespierre denounced both the fanatical atheism of some factions as well as Roman Catholicism, proclaiming instead that to recall men to the pure cult of the Supreme Being is to strike a death blow at fanaticism. He promised that without compulsion, without persecution, all sects must mingle spontaneously in the universal religion of nature. He attacked the clergy as charlatans whose god of the priests was not the god of nature, arguing instead that the real priest of the Supreme Being is nature, his temple, the universe, his worship, virtue. In Robespierre's view, belief in a provident deity and a moral order was indispensable for the new French Republic. The sole foundation and essence of civil society was to be morality and virtue. Thus, the cult's theology was explicitly moral and civic as well. God existed and the soul was immortal, but worship took the form of ethical action, not blind ritual. The convention formally adopted Robespierre's proposals in the decree of May 18th. Article 1 declared, "The French people recognize the existence of the Supreme Being and the immortality of the soul." Article 2 defined the true worship of God as to do one's duties as a man. Article 3 listed those duties: to detest bad faith and despotism, to punish tyrants and traitors, to assist the unfortunate, to respect the weak, to defend the oppressed, to do unto others all the good one can, behaving justly toward all. In short, the Republican virtues, justice, solidarity, opposition to tyranny, were the cult's liturgy. Articles 4 to 5 instituted public festivals to remind men of the deity and of the dignity of their state, to be named after revolutionary events and exalted virtues such as truth, justice, modesty, etc. Robespierre cast the cult as a deistic natural religion. Like Rousseau's social contract on civil religion, it affirmed simple dogmas: belief in God, immortality, reward and punishment, and the importance of civic duty. Robespierre summed up this faith. Quote, God created men to help each other, to love each other mutually, and to attain happiness by the way of virtue. And he warned that the author of nature has bound all mortals by a boundless chain of love and happiness. He insisted there would be no Christ, no Muhammad in these festivals, and no historical creed was permitted to override the Republic. In his address to the convention, he stressed that the recognition of a supreme being and moral law were constant reminders of justice essential to the social order. Robespierre explicitly targeted the Catholic hierarchy, accusing priests of inventing a capricious God. He thundered that priests had created God in their own image. They have made him jealous, capricious, greedy. They treated him as their tool to rule, as the kings of Clovis did. In this rhetoric, the cult repurposed sacrificial language. Priests were known as charlatans. Nature was the true temple, and virtue the only true worship. No liturgy or sacraments survived. Instead, merely devotion was meant as the purest form of active worship. In 1793, radical Jacobins had closed churches, seized church property, required priests to swear loyalty oaths, and even proclaimed an atheist cult of reason, which was detested by Robespierre, and by 1794 he moved to cut it down. For the public, the cult was novel. Some devout still clung to their faith in private, while most joined the civic events out of patriotism. Overall, the cult was a confirmation of the Republic's rejection of Catholic authority and replaced divine mysteries with patriotic ritual. Christianity as a public force all but vanished, seemingly overnight. By Robespierre's fall, worship was only practiced as a private matter. Robespierre's famous address of February 5th, 1794, enshrined his vision that a republican government is founded on virtue, a despotic government on terror. He framed the revolution's terror not as an end in itself, but as the despotism of liberty, a temporary necessity to shield the revolution from its own enemies, not just to subjugate the people. But when the revolution's factions accused Robespierre of masterminding the indiscriminate bloodshed of the French Revolution, he became a lightning rod for collective resentment very quickly. Robespierre allied with Saint Just and Couthon to eliminate the Herbertists, accusing Jacques Herbert and his followers of atheism and fomenting insurrection against the revolution, resulting in their execution on March 24th of 1794. Weeks later, Danton and the Indulgents fell under suspicion of leniency. Robespierre's vote sealed their fate on April 5th, a decision he later defended as a necessity to preserve the revolution against corruption. These purges were aimed at radical excess and counter-revolutionary conspiracies, though they revealed the paradox of Robespierre's own position. The very instrument he intended as a temporary bulwark against tyranny became the engine of wholesale repression. His insistence that the terror without virtue would be destructive, but virtue without terror is powerless, now rang absolutely hollow to many of France's deputies who saw only Robespierre's seeming triumphalism, censuring first the right, then the left, until nobody was immune to his authority. As spring turned to summer, 1794, Parisian streets brimmed with dread. Even the Incorruptible's closest confidants trembled at the thought of appearing insufficiently zealous for the revolution. Robespierre himself, in private musings, acknowledged that the revolution was approaching a precipice. Quote, "Our enemies multiply among those we have spared. Suspicion, like a poison, spreads within our own ranks." But when Robespierre proposed the Saint Just Amendment, a law to outlaw factions within France's National Convention, it was perceived as a direct threat to the deputies' safety, turning Robespierre's own allies into determined opponents. Thus, by mid-1794, the terror born out of necessity and moral fervor had now spiraled into an unstoppable force. Robespierre's ideal of a virtuous republic, founded upon education, moral cultivation, and constitutional checks, had now been overwhelmed by the machinery of denunciation, summary justice, and economic coercion. In seeking to save his revolution from its enemies, Robespierre had in effect become complicit in its most terrible excesses. By July 27, 1794, the convention was a cauldron of fear and intrigue at the same time. Robespierre had spent the preceding days rallying support in clandestine meetings, convinced that there was a plot to overthrow him afoot. Yet, when Robespierre rose to speak that morning, intending to expose traitors within the convention, his own friends had already been neutralized. St. Just's proposal to outlaw factions had been withdrawn, and many deputies, among them Tallien, Fréron, and Fauci, had resolved to strike first. By the summer of 1794, the convention's deputies, many complicit in the terror, but now eager to shift the blame, painted Robespierre as the architect of a tyrannical cult. His own committee colleagues, fearing his moral rectitude would soon turn on them, moved against him. On 9 Thermidor, or July 17, 1794, a coalition of former allies denounced Robespierre and his very closest supporters, stripping all of them of immunity and sentencing them to immediate execution. At the moment of Robespierre's speech, Tallien leapt to his feet, stating, "Citizens, the tyrant speaks. Arrest him." Chaos ensued. Attempts to read Robespierre's imminent address were drowned by shouts of "à la guillotine." Both he and his closest allies, Saint Just, Couthon, Les Bas, were declared outlaws, their immunity immediately revoked. Robespierre attempted to flee to the Hôtel des Villes, but upon discovering it guarded, surrendered himself alongside his faithful companion David. That evening, under heavy guard, the prisoners were conveyed to the municipal prison of the Abbaye. The following morning, on July 28, 1794, or 10 Thermidor, the Revolutionary Tribunal, now under control of the Thermidorians, held a very swift trial, and Robespierre's final words went unheard under the din of hurried proceedings. Within hours, he and 21 of his supporters were sentenced to death without the possibility of appeal. Late that afternoon, Robespierre mounted the scaffold on the Place de la Révolution. An eyewitness recorded his final composure. In the sight of the guillotine's shadow, his eyes remained clear, his voice unshaken. He saluted the fraternal guard as a fellow patriot, then bowed his head to fate. Thus ended the life of the revolution's most fervent idealist, executed by the very machinery he had helped to construct. The terror perpetrated in his own name was eclipsed by the Thermidorean reaction, which unleashed another wave of violence against the Jacobins. Thus, the revolution devoured its most virtuous champion. Robespierre fell not in spite of his integrity, but because his uncompromising virtues had made him many enemies, among them those who feared his own return to moderation. In the days that followed, a fierce purge of the Jacobin Club swept France. Statues of Marat were toppled, the revolutionary calendar was abandoned, and the law of suspects was repealed. Many former committee members fled or were themselves guillotined by the Thermidorians, who branded them new tyrants. But paradoxically, the Thermidorian reaction also restored many of the moderate reforms Robespierre had championed, such as amnesty for political prisoners or freedom of the press, local self-government, albeit stripped of their moral education programs and the vision of an ethically disciplined citizenry. The revolution had consumed its best advocate of virtue, only to preserve fragments of his legacy without its animating purpose. In the immediate aftermath of Thermidor, Robespierre's reputation suffered a torrent of denunciation across France. Les Montieurs and the Paris Journal, under Thermidorian influence, published scathing caricatures depicting him as some sort of bloodthirsty tyrant. But in Jacobin circles, where underground newsletters and meetings preserved his authentic memory, Robespierre was mourned as a martyr of virtue, who had been betrayed by cowardly opportunists who feared his moral rigor even more than they feared royalist counter-revolutions. In the end, the revolution he had loved betrayed him as surely as it consumed thousands of others. Deputies who once hailed his integrity turned on him overnight, and his final hours, spent in defiant silence before the guillotine, acted as a confirmation of his conviction that a republic without virtue cannot endure, and that virtue, when wielded as an instrument of cultural and political power, becomes indistinguishable from tyranny.